Well, he's been a well-known part of Australia's media landscape for more than 40 years. In that time, Ray Martin has interviewed world leaders, Olympic heroes and many celebrities.
Ray Martin has put his favourite interviews together in a collection called, appropriately enough, Favourites. And he joins us now from Sydney. Ray Martin, great to speak to you.
Thanks, Michael, very much.
Ray, you've done 45,000 interviews on your own estimation over a career spanning more than 40 years. How did you winnow it down to this relatively small collection?
Yeah, no, I think I only said about more than 10,000. I can't count more than that, but certainly my period at the ABC and the period with Channel 9, 15 years in the ABC and 30 at Channel 9, it was tough. I got down to about 100 and then we culled it down to about 50 and finally about 30. And I wanted to write some extra chapters. I wrote a piece on Steve Waugh and a piece on Derryn Hinch and a piece on the interview I never had, which was with Bob Dylan. So it was just, the Favourites were a mix of a few politicians, only Paul Keating and Bob Hawke, which was my favourite interview of hundreds I did with politicians just after, back in 1989. And then I did Lowitja O'Donoghue and Patrick Dodson, who are two of my favourite people, happen to be Indigenous leaders. I did them. And then I did a range of singers and comics and movie stars and actors and performers like Michael Crawford.
Now, what makes this book work upon reading it is that it's not just straight transcripts. You annotate the transcripts with observations about body language, background to issues and the like, which makes the conversation stand out even more. But in doing so, in watching these old interviews again, Ray, did you find yourself wanting to ask questions where you didn't ask them or perhaps do them again?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the Don Bradman interview was really his first and his last that he ever did. He did a couple of interviews with Norman May for radio and television, the ABC, some years earlier, but never talked about his private life, didn't talk about Jessie, Lady Jessie, didn't talk about, Warney and more modern cricket. So I'd have loved to have gone back and done that again anyway, because it was just my favourite. But otherwise, I guess you always do that, Michael, don't you? You always think, why didn't I ask there? Why didn't I do so-and-so? In some ways, the Lowitja O'Donoghue interview was one of the most poignant. She's a woman who, by anyone's estimation, has been a great success in Australia. She's whether she was black or green or pink or no matter what colour. And she's been Australian of the Year, and she was the first Indigenous nurse. She was the boss of ATSIC for a while. She's done almost everything short of being the Governor-General. And I think Paul Keating had her on the short list for that as well, and finally gave it to William Dean. So she was beaten by a fantastic man. But when I spoke to her, she really revealed at the end of it that because her father was Irish and her mother was an Aboriginal woman, that she was what used to be called a half-caste in those days, and she kept referring to this, and she felt as though she was in no man's land. She wasn't white and she wasn't black in Australia, and the end result was that she doesn't get the recognition from Indigenous Australians, or that she really gets from white Australians, and she's saddened by that. She found that she had the offer when she was a young woman in Adelaide to get what they used to call the dog tag, to basically, if they were light-skinned Indigenous people, they were allowed to effectively become white. Now, she didn't want to do that because she regarded herself as Indigenous. A lot of the young men who were around her did, because they gave them the right to go to pubs in South Australia and drink. But she never did. They called it this dog tag, that those who signed up basically, wore this tag around their neck to prove that they weren't Aboriginal. But I've done a lot of stuff over the years about reconciliation, and certainly about the stolen generation, etc. And I've never been quite so saddened as when I thought this wonderful, successful, really strong, energetic woman, she turns 80 next year, and she's saddened by the fact that she doesn't feel she lives in either camp, and she's lost in space. And I think that's a really sad sort of reflection on the stolen generation period.
Now, Ray Martin, I asked this next question with more than a dollop of self-interest. What's the secret of a good interview?
I guess, you've got to like talking to people, haven't you, Michael? You've got to also do the homework. One thing that I always read books. If I'm going to talk to someone, it's about their book. I always see the movie, I go and see the play, I go and see whatever it is that they're talking about, have a listen to the record. I did something with David Halberstam, who was the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and when I was based in New York for the ABC, and he had a book out called The Best and the Brightest. And it's probably the best book that I ever read on Vietnam. And he came to the ABC studios in New York for this particular interview, a long interview for the nighttime book show at the time. And I scribble in books when I read them, just for they're my books, and I just want to sort of remind myself about various things, phrases and so on. Anyway, I went to ask a question. I opened the book to read from it, and he said, "Have you read the book?" And I said, "Well, I have, yeah." And he said, "Well, I've just done 260 interviews around America with newspapers and television and radio." He said, "You're the first person who's ever read the book." I got a great interview as a result,
sure
but it was a real lesson for me that, you know, how flattering it is to authors, and I'm on the campaign trail myself at the moment, but when authors actually come up against someone who's read the book and know what it's about. I mean, your very comment there that this wasn't a transcript. The important thing about what I've done here is that I didn't want to just do a transcript, which is a bit what Parky did, and I think a bit what Andrew Denton did with his book, and that's terrific, and they were terrific interviews. But I wanted to, people ask, what's your favourite? Then they say, well, what was that person like? What were they really like behind the scenes? Well, if you start to talk about body language and what happened beforehand and put some of the answers into context, I think it's much more interesting, like a sporting commentary.
Now, you've had a long and glittering career in commercial television, but you've made it very clear that you're pretty disillusioned with the state of commercial current affairs TV at the moment, particularly in the wake of the axing of the George Negus program, your old 60 Minutes colleague on Channel 10. Has this, for want of a better phrase, dumbing down, reached the point of no return?
No, I hope not, and I don't think, you know, I don't know whether it's dumbing down. It's a newspaper or television program or radio program that gives people what they don't want is a program that's doomed to fail. Now, George had 10 months of that, and clearly, as he said in the last show, the reason we're quitting is that you buggers didn't want to watch it, or not enough of you buggers wanted to watch it. Now, that's the same thing with commercial television across the board for, let's say, the 6:30 program. So it's not that they don't want to do the interview with the Prime Minister. It's not that they don't want to do those sort of more serious, let's say, political stories that I'd love to do. The fact is that people don't want to watch. Now, whether it's because the pollies are so boring these days on both sides of the fence, and they are, or they've been, the spin doctors have gone to work on them, and they've basically manicured them and tarted them up so that they have nothing to say, and they're so afraid at the moment to say anything that's controversial. You know, for example, what a current affair last year, I know this for a fact, when they did on the Thursday and Friday before the federal election, they had Tony Abbott on the Thursday and they had Julia Gillard on the Friday. They were the two lowest rating programs by far of the whole year for a current affair. So a commercial program that you know, does interviews or does stories that no one wants to watch is, as I say, is a dead program. So it is a catch-22. You know, the people whinge about the glossy magazines, the weekly magazines in Australia, yet they buy them. They buy so many. So until people start to watch George's program, or until they want to watch the Prime Minister or watch the carbon tax debate, etc., on commercial television, we probably won't get it. So it, you know, my fingers are crossed that I think you can tell these stories seriously, but I don't think it's dumbing down. I just think it's a fact of life.
OK, Ray Martin, great to speak to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Nice to talk to you.